Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Fraser Talbot. I'm Head of Professional Development with IWFM and I'm going to be your host for today. So today's webinar, we're looking at coaching and whether this should be considered a key skill within a workplace and FM professionals toolkit. Coaching is a management tool which can often challenge and develop the skills and abilities of your teams with the aim really to achieve the best performing results and to allow them to function as self-sufficiently as possible. If you manage as a coach, your staff members will learn, grow, and also work quite hard too. As you seek to get the best out of their performance, you're also going to have to put quite a bit into it as well. It's important to remember also that coaching is different from mentoring, although certainly within a business context, the two can be used kind of fairly interchangeably. But we'll kind of touch on some of these key elements through the presentation. I'm pleased to say that we're joined by Mike Duckett as our guest presenter. Mike is an independent coaching psychologist who has been practicing for 23 years and has worked with a broad spectrum of clients in professional sports, entertainment and the arts. He's also worked in facilities management for a number of organisations as well, so obviously understands the context of the profession that we're looking at. Mike will give us his views and ask for yours on the differences between coaching and other development functions such as mentoring and training, as I mentioned. The potential use of simple coaching models in a management context, and also looking at when coaching is appropriate and inappropriate. At the end of this webinar, you will be able to decide whether performance coaching is a skill you'd like to develop within your organisation or whether it's best to be outsourced to the professionals. A couple of points of housekeeping. So on the right hand side of your screen, you should have a menu. There's a question function within that, so we will be asking for your questions, and we will have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. So as we go through the presentation, if you do have any questions, then please put them in that box and we can ask them of Mike. There will be a poll during the presentation as well, so the intention is that the presentation is interactive, so we'll launch the poll, and if you could respond to that, that would be great, just to get a kind of feeling within the audience. Also, if you miss anything, don't worry, slides and the slides for the presentation and the recording of the session will be made available afterwards, and you'll be emailed those. So yeah, you can catch up with anything that you think you might have missed at your own pace, really. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mike and welcome him to today's IWFM webinar. So Mike, hand over to you.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. Excuse me, we were just talking about how this webinar came about. And a little bit of background in it, which is I was at a BIFM, a BIFM network meeting one evening, and on the chairs before it started was a brochure about the academy and the training. And I picked one up and I was just scanning through it. And I just was looking at, well, I wouldn't, I'm filtering for this, I was looking to see what coaching, if any, was in there, and then there wasn't. So it started a conversation through Joanna Lloyd-Davies, actually, and then Linda, about that, about the relevance of coaching. And so up came the opportunity to let's ask a group of people, let's give you my opinion. So this is very much my opinion. Coaching psychology, which I'll come to in a moment, is relatively new. It's certainly not a term like clinical psychology or occupational psychology, and if it were, I would probably be constrained in what I say as a give an agreed definition, etc. But coaching psychology hasn't got that far yet. But I've been practicing. I'm going to switch over to the slides. But I've been practicing for 25 years now, having been in industry for 20 odd years, actually mainly the pharmaceutical industry. And then I started practicing when I met actually a sportswoman. So there's another important point. My take on things, my approach is coloured, I suppose you could say, by my original approach, which was I was working with a sportswoman. It was not part of my day job. I was still employed in the pharmaceutical industry, but from the conversations I had with her, I think it was even her that mentioned the term coaching, because she was distinguishing it from other forms of work she'd done with people. And she said, this is more like working with my old tennis coach when she was a professional tennis player. So I got hold of the term coaching. And in those days, 25 years ago, there were very few people who were involved with coaching. There were a few courses I'd been on as a junior manager, which were to do with curbside counselling of salespeople, or very brief counselling of people. And they were really to do with handling problems, persuading people to do things when they weren't doing it very well. So over the years, this thing called coaching psychology has developed, and I thought it might be useful to just look at the difference between coaching and other developments such as mentoring and training. Fraser certainly mentioned mentoring, and there is a great deal of overlap here. So some might say it's almost semantic, which I don't apologize for, but yeah, we need to look at, is there any difference between mentoring and coaching? Is there any difference between training and coaching? Also look at some of the potential uses, some of the couple of simple models that might be useful in a management context, just to give us an idea then of the kind of questions that might generate, or asking the big question, when is this appropriate and is it inappropriate at all? I think we've got a poll coming up that we were going to ask straight away about having the use of coaching so far. Is that right, Nicole?
Hi there, it's Fraser. Yeah, I can launch the poll now.
Yeah.
So I will launch this for the audience. So the question we're asking is, what is your experience of coaching? So if you can please select any that apply. So you can select more than one answer. So the options are, I have used a coach myself, my organization has used a coach, my organization employs internal coaches, I coach others, or I have coached others, are the options. So we'll just give people a minute or so just to respond to the poll. So the responses are coming in. So we've got about 75% of the audience have responded. Right, so yeah, I think about 75 people have responded, so I'll close that down. So you won't be able to see these, Mike, but I'll just read them out for you. So in terms of the response then, 28% have said I have used a coach myself. 28% have said my organization has used a coach. 31% have said my organization employs internal coaches. I think the most interesting one here actually is 41% have said I coach others, or I have coached others. So a little below 50% then have maybe had some experience of coaching others.
Yes, indeed. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I asked a question about have you used a coach yourself versus the organization use them, because I do work with a number of people who work for organizations that don't use coaches, and they come to me individually and privately. On the other hand, I do a lot of work for organizations that have a whole panel of coaches, of which I'm one. Let's go straight into what is it anyway then that I'm talking about. And I wanted to distinguish coaching, first of all, from what can be confused with guru, what I call guruship. In the early days, certainly, people were expecting a guru, and people did actually refer to me as their guru, and I'm not a guru at all. I tend to think of gurus as people who have probably read a great deal about things like the 7 key steps to success. And they've probably even written a book themselves, which is around that kind of genre. I don't actually believe too much in any kind of 7 keys to success, etc. And I don't have, as a coach, I don't have a lot of tips and tricks for people. Very often, again, this January, the BBC radio got hold of me and said, would I be prepared to come on and talk in January about some tips for people on how to live a fulfilling and happy life? Well, what do I know about that? I'm a coach. It's not about coming from me, it's coming from my client. Now, that brings us closely, I think, right at the beginning to mentoring. And when I very first started all those years ago, my partner, the sportswoman who became my partner, we did a very rough poll. We telephoned a number of organisations to see if they had heard of the term coaching, and if so, what did they mean by it. And mentoring kept coming up a lot. People in conversation would slip from it was a synonym. Over the period that coaching psychology developed, I think, from my point of view, there's definitely a difference between mentoring and coaching, in as much as mentoring is often a hierarchical process. It's about having knowledge and experience that you can pass on to someone. And it usually in a hierarchical sense, not always, of course, because somebody may have knowledge of a culture or an organization or of a particular skill. I have, if they might say, I was a leader within large corporates, can mentor you on leadership. It's a passing on of experience and knowledge, whereas although I may have some experience and knowledge, having worked at a senior level in industry, that's not what my coaching role focuses on. And in fact, I've had a number of clients where we have decided to recruit into the triumvirate a mentor, as well as my client and myself acting as coach, the mentor being able to supply us both with those tips. I wouldn't do that in this culture. The best way to get on is this. That kind of useful bit of information can be useful. So I don't think it's guruship, and therefore I'm always careful to listen for anybody who's using mentoring and coaching synonymously, because I don't regard myself as much of a mentor. My background, as I illustrated, psychology and then into industry, and then I worked with a sports woman before coaching was well defined, and a number of people come from different backgrounds, and because I am registered, because I use a number of therapeutic techniques at times, it sometimes is confused, I think, with therapy or counselling. And there are a number of coaches and indeed whole coaching organisations that have grown out of a therapy background, and it's almost interchangeable. There is one institution I know where on the door it used to say the Centre for Counselling or whatever, it's stress management, whatever it was, and that plaque disappeared and it just simply became the Centre for Coaching. And I think when you go through the door, you get what you always did. You get the first question that is on the other person's mind is, I wonder what the problem is. I wonder what the presenting issue or problem is. And that, for me, is a distinguishing question, because you're asking what the problem is. I suspect you're already into therapy or counselling mode, whereas for me, coaching, the question is, when the doorbell rings, I wonder what this person would like to achieve. So it's very much, for me, coaching is very much more goal orientated. It's performance orientated. In fact, I might start to refer to people during this presentation as my as the performer rather than certainly not the patient and often not the client. I just regard people as the performer, and I avoid, if I can, the term coachee because it doesn't really mean very much. So certainly, I don't think it's therapy, and there have been times when I have suspended the coaching because someone is not in a frame of mind to be able to be thinking about the future, and recommended them and referred them to other contacts I have in clinical psychology or indeed in therapy, deal with that before they can start to come to coaching, which is a future goal orientated. And there may be semantic here because I know we do argue the tot a lot in the British Psychological Society, in the group, the coaching psychology groups, about whether you're actually teaching people processes. And so you are a teacher. I don't tend to think of myself as a teacher, having run, as part of my history in pharmaceutical industry, one of the departments that reported into me has been training. And I don't really regard my coaching input as training input. In as much as I don't think I have a lot to teach my clients. Obviously not completely true. Then if, for example, their goal is to develop a certain leadership style, and what comes up is the ability to communicate and to listen for the other person's position, and I know something about that and I'll share it with them. But I don't regard that as the focus of what we're doing. So I do have clients. I had one client who was on a sabbatical for a year to go to, I think it was Harvard. It certainly went to the States on a leadership development program. And we kept in touch on site. And then when he would return, we were still working together effectively during that period. So he's learning about coaching. He's learning the models. And then he's bringing that learning back to my office, and we're talking about, now, how can we make sense of that for you? How can you turn that into a form of performance? The other distinguishing thing is I don't tend to have an agenda. I don't think many coaches I know have an agenda. The agenda is the clients. We may have an agenda in as much as we're focused on a particular goal, but at any one time the client might even change that. To illustrate what I think people know a lot more than they think they know already about subjects like leadership. And to illustrate, there's a chef that I work with, quite well known, and he was interested in developing his leadership style. As a head chef, the key issue is not whether you can cook at that level, whether you can get the best out of other people. And he said, what do I know? I'm 25, whatever he was, into catering at college. I'd never been on a leadership course in my life. Nobody talks about that when you go to the Royal Academy of Arts and Cuisine. Right, okay, so what do you know about leadership? You know a good one when you see one. And through that little conversation, he identified, without ever having read a book on the subject, half a dozen, probably chapter headings in any one of a number of leadership textbooks. So I think if you give a person the right environment, they will search inside themselves and recognize they know a lot more about these subjects than they think they do initially. So I tend to want to help a person develop their own leadership style, but that's not to deny the value of knowing how to do something and some technical skills. Then they go off for training to develop those. So that brings us to, well, what is it anyway? Well, you probably gathered my main approach, my framework, and I'm a member of the sports division of the British Psychological Society. My main approach, my view of people as performers, you might say, well, that's indicative he's interested in sports psychology, and I am, and I always was. And that's why this lady that I was talking about that became my business partner and I started work. I think that coaching psychology is drawing on three main areas of the well-established areas of psychology, such as sports psychology, where what you bring to the party there is goal theory. There are, in the literature when I last read it, there was over 100 different categories or definitions of types of goals: approach goals, avoidance goals, process goals, outcome goals, etc. A lot of that comes from sports. There's the ability to visualize things. That's a very important element of my work, is getting people to imagine what they would like to achieve, etc. The high performance mindset that you get, that started in the zone of flow. The research started with sports people. The idea that people get into a zone is now well researched. It's a zone where they're performing really well. And it doesn't have to be in sport, but that's where it was originally identified. And things like optimistic thinking, which is a learned behavior. That comes from very much from sport people who manage to stay optimistic. Another area that it's drawing on is occupational psychology. Now, that's very often occupational psychologists move into human resources, and you're probably aware of conversations around team dynamics. A lot of research on team dynamics comes out of occupational psychology. This is where the leadership theories and models are researched, discussed, tested. So situational leadership, or whatever the latest research is telling us about leadership styles, they'd often be the subject of discussion for occupational psychologists, and things like workplace motivation and various theories about motivation. And then finally, as I said before, a number of people have come to the coaching world through psychotherapy route. Now, really, there isn't a clinical psychology that is the registered, but the psychotherapy bit, dealing with people who have difficulty in doing that. There have been a number of techniques that have been developed. So, for example, you will all have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I now hear the term cognitive CBT. I hear a lot of coaches talk about CBC, which is cognitive behavioral coaching. So there are a number of techniques that are very valuable. Hypnotic techniques, for example, NLP practitioners that come out of therapy, very often I might well use some hypnotic language or suggestion with clients to help them break through barriers. They're all coming from this tradition of helping people change something. But if you have a difficulty and you come to therapy, you want something to change. You want to change the way you are reacting, thinking, and behaving. And that's very much a psychotherapy. In the coaching case, they can be applied in a very different context. As I said, starts with the doorbell ringing, and the issue is, do they have a problem? I wonder what it is. Or do they have a goal? I wonder what they would like to achieve, which is more the coaching framework. Moving on to one of the very simple models, which if you've been coaching, those people that have, and certainly if you've been taught any kind of coaching process, tools, then you'll have heard of the GROW model, really, which to my mind is a gap analysis tool. But just to illustrate what it means, it's a really useful agenda setting tool for a conversation during which anything else might happen, but it starts with what's the goal. I would like to ask people just to get another feel, if you could jot down a few words. If you've been coaching, or even if you haven't, what do you think might be the goal, the focus for the coaching that you've done? What kind of goals or aspirations do people bring to the coaching process? Can we ask that now?
Hi there, Mike. Yeah, we can do. We'll let people kind of answer the question and see if we kind of get any kind of responses through. Somebody has asked. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, whilst people are thinking about that, trying to remember what were the goals that they were working on when they were coaching. let me say, a critical issue for me at this stage is that it is grow. I often listen to conversations where it's kind of reversed. And we all do it. You ask the question, what would you like to achieve, which is the start for coaching, and you'll get the response, well, you see, the problem at the moment is, or they'll tell you something about the current state of play, which is really answering the R question, which is, what's the current reality? And I think it's, make this model really work, it's quite important that you do start with the goal. You keep people focused on that before you get into the reality, because people know a lot about what's happening today, and they'll just simply be able to spend a lot of time digging a bigger hole, as it were. The other point is a big question about where's that goal come from? Whose goal is it? It should be, to my mind, the goal of the client. And that's certainly true when you get to the options stage. So you've assessed what is the goal. You're then asking how far away from that are you right now? What's the current state of reality? What do you see as your options for filling that gap? And I use the phrase, what do you see as your options for filling that gap? Illustrating this important point, here again, I've got a response here from Nicola. It's in relation to the personal relationships within the team. Right, okay. Wanting to gain promotion. There's a classic goal that I see quite a lot. Yeah, in a corporation, I'd like to become chairman. I'd like to become CEO. Personal relationships, maybe let them discover ways of having a different outcome. Yeah. Very many goals that I see at corporate are about, if you're not careful, they're about other people changing. And of course, you stop that straight away. You won't deal with that. It's about what are you going to do in the context of someone who is behaving like that? How are you going to stay at your best? So therefore, what's your goal? What's your behavioral goal? How do you want to behave? The relationships, very important. And I want to come back to that when we start asking questions about the appropriateness. I'm giving you just some thoughts about the coach, who is the most appropriate person to coach. Certainly with goals like relationships within the team and so on, reports wants to gain a promotion, improving leadership performance. Yeah, I want to be an inspirational leader. I have a number of people whose stated goal is to be an inspirational leader. I'm already labelled as a leader, or the CEO, but the person who looks back at me in the shaving mirror in the morning or the makeup mirror in the morning is a general manager, and I want to be a leader. So whose options is it anyway? And finishing off the simple model, as you know, I'm sure it has to finish off with some sort of action. Now, I labour this point really because for me, one of the key points I've been making about coaching, it comes from the performer, the coachee, the person. It's all about them. And we were asked, my business partner and I, she's now left the business, she went back to Australia a few years ago, but we were originally asked to go to work with a pharmaceutical company. That's my background, so to work with some of the managers there because developed their coaching skills beyond the basic. They wanted advanced. And of course, I needed to assess what do you currently know? A number of people said, well, one of the key tools that we use the GROW model. Okay, remember these were all managers, by the way, looking at the salespeople and in the medical industry. And we said, would you do some role play so that we get a sense of how you operate this model already? With a little bit of reluctance, we got them into role play. And of course, we heard in not so many words something that goes like, look, you know what your goal is. You have to see at least 5 doctors a day. Now, the reality is you've never seen 5 a day. You've only ever been seeing 2 doctors a day. You know what the options are. You've either got to pull your socks up and start delivering, or we're going to have to let you go. Now, what is it to be? you can't fault the GROW model, but we said we think you're missing a critical element, and I think it's this attitude which is behind any of the tools and techniques that you might learn on a coaching course. The fundamental is the attitude that it's about you and what you want, not about me and what I want you to do. Might be difficult for a manager who is responsible for someone seeing a certain number of customers a day and who currently isn't. It might be difficult to stay away from needing to persuade you or cajole you to do what I want you to do. Another little anecdote: when I first started, my boss had been my boss at a pharmaceutical company, asked me to come back and coach a guy in his department. Could I help him with this new thing called coaching about making decisions? He was incapable of making a confident decision. So we did some work together and he made very confident decisions. He made one which was to move departments and get away from it. Well, I got a phone call from to say, what are you doing? This is not what I intended. You're not supposed to get him to move. And I said, well, I was never there to persuade him one way or the other. A model I do have in mind, which helps you stay away from that, I suppose, given that you have established what the goal is, hopefully, the other person. You may have seen this model presented in a number of other ways, but I draw on it from a sports perspective, and I think of it as the model of the zone of flow. There's a lot more to the zone of flow than this. Quite simply, if someone has a goal, I've drawn it in the cloud because it's an aspiration, and you're looking down at them, what is the subject for discussion? Well, in actual fact, there's quite a lot of work around that goal. As you heard, there's over 100 different definitions of goals, and the way you talk about a goal reflects the way you think about that goal, which reflects the way you will probably behave to achieve it. So there's a lot of goal work, but then there is, of course, what will you do? What's the behavior that you need to indulge in to be at your best to achieve that goal? The next level down is, well, do you know how to? Do you know how to do what you need to do to achieve that goal? Which is, of course, now to get over that with training. Do you have the capability to be able to perform? Do you have the knowledge? Do you need to go on some extra training? That's where the training department can come in. But knowing how to and doing something really well are two different things. Often, when we really start to get into changes in performance, it really comes from unlocking whatever else is around or inside that knowledge, the ability to do something, not being delivered as well as it could be. I had lots of managers who went on leadership courses in my days in the pharmaceutical industry, but it didn't seem to make a lot of difference to their daily performance when they returned. Now, they knew how to do something. They were pretty clever guys. The issues are, as a person, what are your, let's call them motivators, what are your values, your belief systems? What are the things that are going on beneath the surface that will allow you to do what you want to do or will get in your way? Finally, this particular model, I'll end it here, where it says, in order for that performance to be delivered smoothly and at a really high level, it needs to be part of who you are. I'll illustrate this with a client of mine many years ago. I worked with her, but she was originally in rally driving, and I hadn't met her before. And I said, well, okay, so your goal is to win ladies World Rally Championship. Tell me about yourself. And she said, well, I'm a TV presenter and I do a lot of professional driving. They're two very different statements. So I would, as an independent coach, be roaming over all these areas, including what's the context. We need to think about this. What is the context within which takes place in your organization. And the context, to use a previous example, I think it was, said, how can I build better relationships and perform better? And it isn't about the other people. In the context of working with someone who is a really difficult person to work for, how can I still be at my best? So I will have conversations about the context within which something needs to happen, which brings me to a distinction between coaching and consulting. There are a number of organizations that have labeled themselves as coaching organizations, but whenever I've spoken to them, in my mind, a conversation is going to be maybe about some behavior, but it's very much about context. It's about the marketplace, your strategy, maybe even a business model that they believe is appropriate to teach you. That's very much consultancy. I'm more interested in the whole of this. I think that might be Joanna Lloyd-Davis. Her goal, I do remember this, was to participate in the clipper race around the world and to fit into the team. And Joanna and I had some very interesting conversations about what you learn from that, about managing upwards. Maybe you can share that with people afterwards, Joanna, when you meet them. So that's a very commonly used, commonly quoted, you've probably seen it in maybe a slightly different form before, but it can be, along with the GROW model, it can be extremely useful to be listening for where people are coming from, if you like, what's their current reality and what it needs to be at various levels. And that, just using this model, and we could have chosen a number of other models, but I thought if we chose this model, it might then give us an opportunity to say, well, if you were to develop, to train people internally, what kind of training, what kind of skill base do we think people could usefully develop as a manager? What could you build into management skill? Well, if we just take this model, well, of course, there's goal setting. There's a lot of potential learning to be done around listening for the way that people articulate what they would like to achieve. There is systems thinking and attribution errors come up in terms of the context when I'm listening to people. Systems thinking, realizing that people are, no man is an island, we all are ripples in a big pond, etc. And also attribution errors, going back to better relationships with people, a little bit of theory around not focusing too much on the person, the exclusion of the context within which the person is performing. It can help, that idea can help people change their view of the person that perhaps is irritating them. There are a number of other theories that might help have a discussion around the context that people find themselves in. Of course, values elicitation. If you really want to dig beneath the surface, figure out what's going on, having the capability, we're sure you're capable, but something's getting in your way, then there are ways of eliciting a person's value system, which, again, my language, eliciting it from the other person rather than persuading them what their values should be, to find out what they truly value, to see if there are any conflicts, or to see if they're in line with what is necessary. And at a similar kind of level, there is work and training that can be done about working with beliefs. How do you know when somebody's formed a belief? When I always think when somebody says, "Well, I think," listen up, because here comes a belief. It may or may not be true. The question is it useful? And what can you do about that? Should you be persuading And here's where the manager puts his cap back on and decides that's the wrong kind of idea. I need to persuade you to an alternative. That to me is not a coaching idea. Is the belief working for you or not? If we get to the end of this, what I'd show you reasons to coach, which if you look at the bottom there, this guy Best. In April 2000, so coaching psychology has been developing for quite a long time, and way back in the occupational psychologist, this guy did this little chart, which I thought was quite interesting back then, to look at what would be the reasons to start coaching. And they were obviously to do with whether someone is being reactive or proactive, and versus also alongside with whether they are someone who is really trying to catch up and fill the demands of the past, as he puts it, or the demands of the future. And in the very, very early days, all my initially all my work was in that top left-hand corner. The phone would go and it would be about, we have a problem person, and we don't think it's a training issue. Can you kind of save the day? And we did, in the early days, did a lot of work in that area. As you can imagine, the ideal client is in the bottom right. Someone who is change focused, is always looking ahead and wants to stay ahead, because they're the kind of person that's going to take to coaching as a resource, whereas the person on the top left, there's always the difficulty that they may be approaching it as something that's being done to them, and they'll go along with it to varying degrees, whereas the bottom person on the right is welcoming it as a resource and takes responsibility for what happens in the coaching room. That might be for a manager to allow and continually challenge the other person to take responsibility rather than the manager. The intention of this little presentation was to, whether there are any key questions that you could ask when you've got the answers to them already, but ask before you leap into coaching, developing a coaching culture. There might be some questions like, what really is the role of our managers in relation to the performer? I mentioned therapy early on. We know that it's a lot of research from therapy that it really doesn't matter what the technique is, that whether you're going to practice CBT or hypnotherapy or whatever you're going to practice. The critical thing in terms of beneficial outcomes in therapy is the relationship between the therapist and the client. That research is being validated also in situation. It's less to do with the tools and techniques you bring, a lot more to do with the kind of relationship you establish with your client in terms of the beneficial outcomes. So it's worth thinking carefully about what is the role of our manager, and would that be stretched or compromised if they were to engage in what I'm calling coaching. Will it fit with the culture of the organisation? Strikes me. The earlier story I told about the pharmaceutical company, it was really apparent that it wasn't really easy for the culture to accept that you put in the driving seat the coachee, call it, the performer. They were there to be managed, persuaded, and got rid of if they didn't deliver. Does it fit this idea of responsibility sitting in that seat, not yours? Does it fit with the management and leadership culture of the organisation at the moment? Even if it doesn't, or if it does, would an internal coach, as distinct from the manager, part of the answer? I do know, and I do work, oddly enough, I do work with some organisations that have teams of internal coaches. the idea being that they are very distinct from the managers, so they can preserve that relationship between manager and performer and still do some coaching. Could that fulfill the development needs? And as I've just said, a couple of the larger global companies I work for, both, they have internal coaches, and they all also will come to me or externally at times. And I think I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think there'll always be a role for external coach who is prepared to go to some of those areas I've hinted at, will make the difference between performance and non-performance, but are going to be very difficult for an internal person to go near. Will you ever have the ability to develop that kind of trust? And I often say, it's when we get to the point where the person says, looks around the room and looks at me and says, do you know what, between me and you, that's when we've made a breakthrough. I don't know if that breakthrough can ever happen at times with an internal coach. It's worth thinking about. Maybe the model that's appropriate for your organisation is a bit of both. So I think that brings you to your any questions and your next opportunity for a webinar.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Mike. Yeah, it was an excellent presentation. I'll go back to Joanna asked a question right at the very start, which I think is probably relevant for those who are kind of interested in, kind of taking on a bit more of a coaching role. So Joanna's asked, at what stage in your career should you contemplate performance coaching?
Yeah. I think any stage of your career at all. The whole range of people I work with, not all of them are in corporate. I do some work with the homeless voluntarily, and I do some work with the Prince's Trust. People who have not got a career, let alone beginning one, right through to people who are currently running big organisations. So I don't think any stage at which coaching is inappropriate. If you have something you would like to achieve, we're off. There's an opportunity to do some coaching.
Linda's asked a question, and I think it kind of links back to kind of some of the points you raised in the questions, really about kind of potential barriers to this process. And Linda's asked, how should you approach the situation when the individual who had wanted to receive coaching then begins to resist the process?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It sometimes occurs. I will answer what should you do, what could you do, not what should you do, but what you could do in a moment. But it sometimes occurs when the person hasn't really understood what coaching is, and they believe that they're going to come to coaching either to learn some stuff, so go on then, what are you going to teach me today, or they believe that it's an opportunity to figure out how to change other people. They're not comfortable with self-reflection. So that's usually the core issue when they come to it and then start to, they say they want it and then resist it. What you can do about that, I think, is there is no, I don't really have an answer. Terminate is the wrong word. I don't throw them out, but the coaching can't proceed. So as an independent, I'm able to say, right, let's think about the right intervention for you, because this process isn't working. If you're resisting it, by definition, it's not for you. What are you resisting, and therefore, what are you looking for instead? Are you hoping to be taught something, in which case it's a training issue, and so on. So that's, I've got an easy get out. I can say, oh, sorry, this isn't going to work for you. What you do if you're an internal coach and the client, the performer, starts to resist, really no. I think you very carefully go back to whoever was their sponsor and suggest that between them they think about an alternative intervention. Hope that helps, Linda.
I'll just give a few more minutes for people to ask questions if they like. There was one thing I was kind of thinking of, and I suppose knowing kind of different organisation types as well. I mean, you certainly get, I think coaching may be more, I don't want to say suitable, but maybe more accepted within organisations that have a more supportive, looser kind of structure. But then you might have more traditional hierarchical organisation structures where there's more of a kind of parent-child almost kind of relationship with kind of line management. So, how does the organisational culture kind of impact on that ability to provide, kind of really good coaching and kind of good value coaching?
Yeah, if you're asking my opinion, how does it impact? It has a huge impact, which is why I do get clients who belong to organisations that either do not employ or don't think the coaching process is worth investing in, or it's not right for them. And I do get private clients. I think it can get in the way because, and I'm conscious of a question from, I don't know who it's from, I'll come to this in a moment, about people acting as coaches when they haven't had the experience. To go back to your point, there have been times, I'm thinking of one in particular, where an organisation puts someone forward for change. When they change, the organisation is bound to have to change itself, the systems thinking. That, and very often, the key question to the sponsoring manager is, what will you find yourself wanting to do differently when this person changes their behaviour? And if there is a reluctance to make any change in the organisational behaviour, then that's a bit of an alarm bell for me, and I think it can really get in the way. Does that answer your?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. I think it was Joanna who'd asked about. She was saying, I wonder why people act as coaches when they haven't had the experience of being coached. Could that be a bit dangerous? And is there anything to benchmark from? It also ties in. Catherine's asked, line managers who are forced to complete coaching as part of their role when they have no interest in being coached. So I suppose it's kind of both sides of that coin, isn't it? Those who do it, who perhaps don't have the necessary skills and, might cause issues, and those who are kind of forced into to perform in the role.
For Joanna's question in particular, I'm not too protective over the intervention. I think we've been coaching without realizing it for centuries. I think if you've had an attitude of what was the old thing, I don't believe anybody comes to work deliberately to screw up. If you have an attitude that there is something here that this person would like to achieve but is behaving in a way that isn't helping them, how can we? That's a coaching approach. So if it's just a simple conversation around that, you're doing coaching. You may not be employing some of the techniques, and maybe the techniques, the processes that are sometimes taught, if they're used inappropriately, they might do some harm. But if you're staying away from things like people's fundamental beliefs, when you hear some really key beliefs or a sense of identity, and if you're staying away from situations that you realize are really therapeutic, then I doubt that you're going to do any damage in a corporate sense. If the goal is I want to be chairman, I want to be CEO, and well, there are a number of ways you could work with that person. I don't think they're going to be risky. But to go on to line manager who are forced to complete coaching. I think that means, Catherine, saying people have had to go on a coaching course and they've no real interest in being a coach. You know what I think? I think, if the truth be known, that was true of those people I described, and there was about over 20 of them. I'd say the vast majority in that group I described, where they used the GROW model inappropriately. The reality was they they felt under great pressure. They didn't want to operate as a coach. They would, thankfully, they would very grateful to be able to hand someone over to me and say, look, will you, because my job is to insist, my job is to manage, to recruit the right people and to hand them over to the right people to help them develop, but then to monitor and measure, and it might even be to fire them. And I don't see where coaching fits in that. I understood their dilemma. There are times when if someone might need to be told this needs to happen, and that's not a coaching conversation in my mind. That's someone being a manager that's saying we have this big need in the organisation to hit this particular target, and what are we going to do about you not performing? No. Okay. So I think there is a lot of management, a lot of coaching, training, and that might be why I thought we'd do this webinar, to be honest, to pose some of the questions. If you really know what coaching is, according to me, then it's easy to answer the question, why should I send someone for this kind of training?
Thanks, Mike. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. It's been a really interesting and kind of thought-provoking presentation. Just for our audience, next webinar is going to be on the 28th of February, so just over a week from now, and it's looking at our recent sustainability survey, the report findings. Upcoming training, we have a number of training courses which will be going on in March. So Essentials of Workplace Leadership will be taking place on the 7th of March. That's a 3-day course. The initial 2 days are in March. Operational Space Planning on the 13th of March. FM Strategic Sourcing on the 18th of March. Time Management, Delegation and Organisational Skills on the same day. And also our Improving Customer Experience course as well on the 19th of March. So, Mike, again, thanks a lot for your time today. It's been a really interesting presentation. Yeah, a lot of food for thought for the FMs within the audience, and I think it is something that really should be within our managers' toolboxes in terms of the skills that they have. So, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, everybody, hopefully see you on our next webinar. So thanks a lot for joining us today.
Bye.